Here are the resources you're going to need for your rabbit ear napkin ring. So I've got 2 coordinating fabrics. These are just offcuts because I like to use my material up. Then I've got my pattern piece. I've got craft scissors to make sure that I can cut paper. I have my fabric scissors to cut my fabric. I've got embroidery snips to cut my thread. I've got a range of pins, but also sewing clips. I like to use these at times, and sometimes it's good to have a variety of both. I'm going to use a fabric marker. This one is a friction pen, so it disappears with heat. I have my coordinating thread to go with my fabric. I have a wooden hoop, but if you don't have a wooden hoop, you could easily use a hair elastic. This one is a 55mm wooden hoop that is used for macrame as well. And then I've got a corner shaper, or you could use a chopstick or an old pencil. I'm also going to need my ironing mat and my iron and my sewing machine. The first job will be to cut out our pattern piece. Now on your pattern piece it tells you to cut 1 from your main and 1 from your lining. So let's talk about that first. The main fabric is the fabric you want to be seen from the front. So these are my rabbit ears, and I wanted the pattern fabric to be seen first and foremost, but it could have easily been the other way round. When I talk about lining fabric, I'm talking about the fabric that goes on the back. So you could have the same fabric front and back, or you could have different ones like me just to add that contrast. It's entirely up to you. The second thing to note on the pattern piece is down here where it says position on fold before cutting. So we're going to cut our pattern piece out following the dotty lines. We're also going to cut across here. However, when we are positioning this, our actual fabric piece will look like a long strip. We need an ear either side. So this is just one ear. And if we position this on the folded fabric before we cut it out, we will have a long version of this pattern piece instead. To cut our fabric, we are going to fold it in half. Now because mine is an offcut, I just want to check that I can actually fit the pattern piece on properly. So I'm going to flip mine over because I have a raw edge there that I need to pay attention to. So I folded my piece of fabric in half, and then this folded edge becomes the line where I position this particular piece of the pattern piece. So remember, it says position on fold before cutting. I have just got enough fabric here, so I'm going to pin that into position. Now when you're pinning your fabric pattern piece in place, it's important that you go along this edge, because that's going to make sure that your cut line is as accurate as you can be using fabric scissors. So there are alternatives. You could be using a rotary cutter and a cutting mat. You could draw around the pattern piece and then cut it out that way. But I find that if you're using a double layer, it is better to pin and cut if you haven't got a rotary blade. So I've just pinned along those edges, and we're going to be cutting through those 2 layers. So always cut away from yourself when you are cutting. Try not to cut like around and back on yourself. Always move your project, and if you've pinned it well, you'll have no problem at all. Using your fabric scissors tend to have a long blade, so try to use that full cutting blade to your advantage. When you're cutting, open the blade wide and close it rather than doing lots of little cuts, and that will try and help you get that smooth line. Rest your blade against your cutting table and take your first cut. Once done, you can remove the pins and then use that pattern piece to cut another piece of fabric for the other side. So because we cut it on the fold, we now have a long shape. So Cut 2 of those and you'll be ready to start sewing. To prepare for sewing, we're going to lay one of our fabrics right side up, and then we're going to position our second fabric right side down over the top. So if this were a patterned piece, this would be the right side of the fabric, the front of the fabric. We would position that right side down over the top. Once there, you're going to pop 2 pins, or you are going to mark a gap. So different ways that I mark a back gap. Sometimes I will use my fabric marker and just put 2 little marks. We're going to be leaving this as a gap open so that we can turn our project through the right way round when we finished sewing. So either mark with your fabric pen, or I'm going to use pins now, and then I'll clip around the extra edges. And so for me, where the pins are, that's where I know I need to start and stop my sewing. So it's just doing something that is different to remind you what the gap is. Sometimes I will add a double pin here and here, which just means I put 2 pins super close together and then pin around the rest of the project. And where there is a double pin, I then know that that's where I need to start or stop my sewing. So when we go to the sewing machine, we are going to start sewing at this pin here. We're going to sew all the way around until we reach the next pin. So we will reverse for a few stitches, sew, 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 and reverse stitch here, leaving that gap to turn through later. For my machine settings, I am using a medium length straight stitch. So make sure that your top thread and your bobbin thread are underneath your presser foot and then pushed out of the back of your machine like a tail, and then fold a scrap piece of fabric in half and position that under your machine and trap it. Now the reason I am doing this is like a test stitch, and I just want to make sure that my top thread and my bobbin thread are making stitches that look nice and the tension is right. Remove that from the machine, and what I'm looking for is, do my stitches on the top look like stitches, and do the ones at the back look like stitches as well. If anything looks like a straight line with some bumps on it, then you're going to need to rethread your machine top and bottom and start again. That should solve your problem. For the project itself, we are going to position the rabbit ears with the pin, there's my gap, this pin closest to me. Once I'm there, I'm lining up so I have a 1 centimetre seam allowance. I'm going to slide that pin out because I am in position. Lower your presser foot, and then you're going to take a few reverse stitches. So on my machine, I have a reverse button. For some of you, you may have a lever over on this side that you might need to push down and hold to reverse for a few stitches. So I'm going to press and hold my reverse. Just 2 or 3 stitches will do, and then you're going to start sewing, and I'll give you some tips of how to sew round a curve as we go. So when I reach more of a corner, I'm going to put my needle down by winding my hand wheel towards me. That's going to drop my needle into the fabric, which helps me keep in the right position when spinning my project around. So with a corner, I do that. However, when it comes to just a curve, what I'm doing is I'm keeping my eye at all times on the edge of the fabric. I'm not watching the needle, I'm watching the edge of my fabric, and I want to keep the distance here equal at all times. So with the curve, I am gently encouraging, I'm kind of moving the fabric that way as I go, encouraging it into the machine. And then kind of bringing myself, I've got a straight line here, so bringing myself, nudging that fabric further across. I can take my clip out. And you can see that I'm now on the straight line up to the tip. So what I've been doing is gently encouraging the fabric in the direction that I would like it to go. Take that final clip out. Now when I reach the tip, I'm going to make sure that I stop about 1 centimetre away before the edge. Again, I'm going to make sure my needle is down. We are treating this like a corner. Needle down, lift, spin, trap, and sew. So again, we're starting with a straight line, which is nice and easy. But then we are coming to this curve. So when I come to this curve, I'm just going to be gently encouraging the fabric to twist. If you're finding that tricky, you can always stop, put your needle down, lift and rotate the fabric slightly before you carry on. So continue around your shape until you reach the pin at the other side or your mark that you made. So remember you're leaving a gap and make sure to reverse stitch at the end. We've now completed our line of sewing. It started here with a reverse stitch. We've gone round the 2 rabbit ears and we've stopped here and reversed. So the gap is still there. However, before we turn this through the right way round, we just want to remove the excess fabric. So at these 2 tips, we've got to squeeze all of this fabric into this tiny space when we turn it through the right way round. So to help that out, what we're going to do is just snip close to, but not through, the stitching. So we're just removing the excess fabric from the tip of each ear. So again, we're just removing fabric by cutting close to, but not through, the stitches. We don't want to go too close, we don't want to create a hole, but we're just removing the excess fabric to make it easier here. Likewise, on a curve, that fabric needs to squeeze into that space. So on a curve, we can either trim it close, but I'm always worried that I'll trim too close when I get close to my gap. So instead, you can either make some little slits, and I'm going to use my smaller scissors so that you can see. Then that fabric can overlap, or what I prefer to do is actually create small triangles cut out of the fabric, again to get rid of that bulk. So I tend to use my embroidery snips instead, because I don't want to cut through my stitches by accident with my fabric scissors. So that one is more of a diagonal cutout that goes close to, but not through my stitching, and that will reduce the bulk ready to squeeze in there, and it'll give you a nicer curve. So I'm going to repeat that for this curve here, and then again for the 2 curves on this side. Now that we have removed the excess fabric at the tips and then again on the curves, we're going to use our gap to turn through our project. Now I would do 1 ear at a time, because otherwise one might end up hiding inside another one. So I'm just using my fingers to push from the inside, or you might want to use it, it's a little bit like opening a crisp packet where you squeeze it from the outer. And then I'm going to do the same with the other side, so push that through the gap you created. Bag all of it out so that you're finding those side seams that you had. And And then, as you can see at the moment, it's not a very impressive shape, and that's why I use a corner shaper, or you could also use a chopstick or an old pencil, and it's just going in around those seams to find the curve that you created, and to make sure at this corner point that you are pushing the excess fabric that's there into the tip so that you get a more angular point. So I'm coming round the curve again, and then I'll go round the other side. So I'm finding that curved edge, encouraging it out, paying attention to the tip and pushing that fabric up into the tip so I get a nice pointy rabbit ear. And then round this curve at the side and back. So we've now got something a little bit more like the shape we had. And then you're going to just give your fabric a kind of little massage so that the front fabric is right on the edge with the back fabric. Nothing's kind of got tucked inside like this before we iron. We want to make sure that your seam is right along the edge. So kind of roll it with your fingers, then give it a finger press. And then the side we need to pay particular attention to, just pull that bit out, is where we have the gap, because we obviously want to make sure that we seal that gap. We don't want any loose threads or openings still being there after we've top stitched, which is our last step. So where the gap is on this side, I'm going to make sure that my seam allowance is tucked in by 1 centimetre in line with that stitching we did previously. I'm just giving it a finger press to hold it in place. And I'm going to flip and make sure I do the same so that pattern fabric is folded in by 1 centimetre. So that's why seam allowances are really important. If we do a seam allowance that's too close to the edge at the start, we're going to find top stitching harder, and it will be harder to close that with a top stitch. So give your project a good press around all of those edges, and that will make the next step, which is top stitching, much easier for you. So our final job is to sew a line all the way round this time. No gap is going to be left. We're going to top stitch. Now top stitching just means instead of sewing 1 centimetre in, which we did before, this is where the edge of our fabric is hiding inside, we're actually going to sew 1/2 centimetre in, and that way we'll be sealing that gap closed, and we'll also be creating structure around our rabbit ears to help hold it in place. So at the machine, sew a 0.5 centimetre seam allowance all the way around the outside, making sure to reverse at the start and at the end. My threads are underneath my presser foot and tucked out the back like a tail. And I'm going to start sewing actually in this centre point here. So what the reasoning for it is, it's easier to sew on a straight line. So starting off on a straight line is good, but also this section is going to end up knotted into the actual final product. So I won't see if there's any stitching overlapping here. So I'm going to position my fabric, and as I said before, rather than it sticking out the side like it did previously, it's now further over to the left, so my needle is sewing closer to this edge. Reverse for a few stitches, and then start sewing forwards. Take your time, go nice and slowly, easing your way around those curves when you reach to it. So remember, I'm just kind of nudging the fabric around. My eyes are always on the edge of the fabric. I am not watching the needle. I'm making sure that the edge of my fabric is in line where I want it to be. We do the same at the corners. So we make sure our needle is down in the fabric, lift, spin, trap and sew. To create the rabbit ears themselves, you are going to use either the wooden hoop. So as a reminder, this one is 55mm wide. They are used for macrame. They're also used for baby teething rings and things like that. Or you could use a hair tie, just a hair elastic would do the job as well. So with your ears, you are going to fold them in half, creating this fold which will become a loop, and you're going to push that fold through your ring or your hair elastic. I'm then going to take my pinchy fingers, so my thumb and forefinger, I'm going to push those through the fold so that I can grab the tips of the ears. I've grabbed those with my fingers and I'm just going to pull those tips through that hoop so that my ears come out the other side. Make sure they're kind of roughly even in terms of length, and then have a play with the position so that you get the fabric where you want it. I'm just twisting it slightly so that I've got the patterned ears at the front, but likewise you could easily have the patterned fabric at the back, or you could have the same fabric front and back. It really doesn't matter, but have a little play, a little tweak, a little adjustment, and you will end up with the most gorgeous rabbit ear napkin ring. This then can be used with a napkin. You would just sew a square of fabric. I will give you a pattern to get these lovely mitered corners. I'll put that free on my YouTube channel as well. But your napkin just goes through and you are ready for Easter lunch. If you're up for a challenge, this was a free pattern to go alongside my hexagonal placemat. You can find all the information for this on my website, oodlesofcraft.com. If you found this tutorial easy to follow, please have a look on my website for further freebies, and I've also got some paid patterns there as well. Enjoy making.